The problem was never just the bite. It was the kind of boy the bite found. Kaneki enters Tokyo Ghoul, already prepared to disappear. He has learned that goodness means yielding, kindness means taking the damage quietly, and love means making yourself easy on other people. Not heavy, not dangerous, not difficult. So when horror finally reaches him, it does not collide with resistance. It collides with someone who already feels guilty for having needs. Everything breaks in that alley. He walks beside Rise carrying the smallest, softest hope. A date after talking about books. A pretty girl who liked the same words he liked. The fragile thrill of being chosen by someone brighter than his lonely life usually allowed. Then the night turns. Her smile sharpens. Her voice drops. The flirtation peels away, and something underneath it steps forward hungry. She backs him between wet brick walls like she has been waiting all evening to stop pretending. In a few seconds, the fantasy is over. Kaneki's gentleness does not protect him. It only leaves his throat open. Then the steel falls. The girders crush Rise in a burst of blood and twisted metal so sudden it feels less like chance than a sentence. Kaneki should die there too. Instead, Dr. Kanu does something worse than saving him. He puts Rise's organs inside him. The body that wanted to eat him becomes the body that keeps him alive. Survival enters him as violation. He wakes up breathing because the monster is now under his skin. That is where the story starts. Philosophy only matters if it helps us see what that does to him. Nietzsche matters here because Kaneki's weakness is not simple fear. It is moral training. Nietzsche distrusted forms of morality that turn helplessness into virtue and called power itself corrupt. His target was specific, the kind of person who cannot imagine strength without cruelty, so they start treating passivity as purity. If force frightened you deeply enough, then eventually not fighting begins to feel like innocence. That is Kaneki before he is ever half ghoul. His first wound is not Kano's surgery. It is the belief that a good person is the one who suffers quietly and never becomes a threat. Long before he changes physically, he has already built a self around endurance. He does not know how to protect himself without feeling selfish. He does not know how to want anything without apology. He does not know how to draw a line without hearing, somewhere inside, that he is becoming cruel. So when he wakes after the operation, the horror is larger than the body. His whole moral language collapses. He has no idea how to live with strength without imagining brutality. He has no model for need that does not feel shameful. You can feel that collapse in the smallest scenes. Hyde sits with him. There is bread. There is coffee. There is the ordinary texture of human life, so ordinary it hurts. Kaneki tries to eat, and his body rejects it instantly. He gags. He spits it out. Retches over food that used to mean comfort. The scene is hard to watch because nothing dramatic is happening. No one is attacking him. No grand speech explains the moment. He is just sitting there realizing that his own mouth has turned against the world he belonged to. Then the truth gets worse. Not symbolically, literally. He can only live on human flesh. That is where the chapter cuts beneath body horror. Kaneki is not only disgusted by what he is becoming, he is disgusted by need itself. He starves himself, hides it, tries to bear it alone, as if secrecy could make hunger less real. He is terrified of hurting anyone, yes, but he is also terrified of being the kind of person who requires anything from anyone. That fear sounds gentle. It is not always gentle. Nietzsche saw something ruthless hidden inside self-denial. He understood that self-hatred can harden into identity. A person can become attached to being the one who suffers best, the one who asks least, the one who breaks without complaint. From far away, that looks humble. Up close, it can be another form of control. If I endure everything alone, then at least I stay morally clean. At least no one can say I became dangerous. Kaneki lives exactly there. He would rather collapse than contaminate anyone else. He would rather vanish than risk taking up predatory space in the world. And if you have ever mistaken self-erasure for goodness, this lands hard. Some people are not trapped by open cruelty. They are trapped by the quiet, hidden cruelties they impose on themselves. Led by the need to remain harmless even while life is tearing them apart. They start believing suffering proves they are still good. They start believing need is a stain. By the time they see what that belief is doing to them, pain is no longer just something they feel. It is the role they know how to play. That is the trap closing. Pain that cannot be shared starts asking to become identity. Kaneki cannot return to being human. He cannot accept being ghoul. He has nowhere stable to stand, so suffering begins to offer him a place. If agony is constant, then at least it is real. If he is in pain, then at least he is not surrendered to appetite. The wound starts to feel morally useful. It becomes evidence that he is still fighting the monster, still resisting, still not fully gone. This is one of Nietzsche's sharpest insights. People do not merely endure suffering, they give it meaning so they can survive it. Sometimes that meaning saves them, sometimes it chains them to the injury. If pain becomes the main proof of who you are, then healing begins to feel suspicious. Letting go starts to feel like betrayal. You see versions of this everywhere. People keep circling the same wound because it gave shape to the self that came after it. The damage explains their distance, their caution, their silence, their anger. They may hate what happened, but they fear who they would be without it. Pain becomes structure. Sometimes it becomes innocence. Yes, his body is changed by Rize, by steel, by Kano's experiment. But the deeper change is in how he starts reading himself. He does not ask the clean survival question, how do I live now? He asks the more dangerous one, how much can I endure without becoming evil? It sounds noble. It is also a perfect way to bind yourself to suffering forever. Because if pain is what proves your goodness, then escaping pain starts to look like corruption. And that is the dark center of Tokyo Ghoul. To survive unbearable suffering, Kaneki turns pain into identity. He makes agony the last place where he can still recognize himself. But that strategy carries a threat inside it. If suffering becomes the thing that tells you who you are, then overcoming it may start to feel like self-betrayal. And if you keep feeding that logic, the monster does not only live in your body, it gets to author your soul. That is the question following him now, even if he cannot name it yet. When does surviving horror stop being resistance and become surrender to what horror made inside you? Kaneki does not know. Not yet. He only knows that he is hungry, ashamed, alive, and already learning that refusing the monster can become its own way of serving it. This is the anime mind, where even in the dark, something in you can still grow while you sleep. And with Kaneki, the question is no longer how much pain he can survive, but what that pain is slowly making of him. And this is the part people soften too much. Kaneki's gentleness is not simple innocence. It is a shelter built in emergency. When Toka drags him into life at Anteku, she does not let him hide inside ideas. She puts his body in front of him. He tries normal food and immediately vomits. Rice tastes rotten. Bread turns to sludge. Meat reeks. Everything that used to mean comfort now triggers revulsion. Then comes the rule that humiliates him most. He can stay alive only by consuming human flesh. Not as Gothic metaphor, as routine, as biology. Toka's harshness in those scenes is not sadism. It is triage. She mocks his denial, because denial for a ghoul is just suicide with better manners. What matters is how Kaneki reacts. He does not erupt first. He shrinks. He is not outraged by what he has become, so much as ashamed of it. And shame makes him cling even harder to kindness. If he can still be gentle, still apologize, still protect, then maybe the change is incomplete. Maybe the monster stopped at the body and never reached the self. That hope is partly noble. It is also panic. Yoshimura sees this almost immediately. When he places a cup of coffee in front of Kaneki and explains that coffee is one of the few things ghouls can still enjoy, the moment lands because it is so small. No speech, no dramatic revelation, just warmth in a cup, bitter steam rising between people who cannot share a meal with anyone else. Coffee matters because it preserves a human rhythm. Sit, breathe, taste something, speak softly. Reorganized around hunger and concealment. That ritual becomes fragile proof that appetite is not the whole self. Kaneki reaches for that atmosphere because he needs somewhere his horror can lower its voice. Anteku does not erase what he is. It gives him a gentler room in which to postpone facing it. That is where Nietzsche becomes useful. He distrusted ideals that are built mainly as defenses against pain. Not because kindness is fake, but because people often call something virtue when it is also a survival strategy. A person is overpowered, humiliated, wounded, and then turns powerlessness itself into moral purity. Softness becomes highest, harmlessness becomes highest, restraint becomes highest. Sometimes that is wisdom. Sometimes it is fear protecting itself with beautiful language. That is close to what Kaneki is doing. His compassion is real. His concern for others is real, but it is also serving another purpose. It protects him from naming the new fact of his existence. He now survives through predation. As long as kindness remains the truest thing about him, he can postpone the more terrifying thought that hunger is not merely a curse pressing on him from outside. It is part of him. You can see the same pattern outside fiction. Someone survives something brutal, then organizes their whole identity around never becoming the sort of person who could do harm. They become the gentle one, the safe one, the one who absorbs pain without returning it. Because often it is. But underneath, there is sometimes a bargain. If I stay good enough, then what happened to me will not own me. The problem is that goodness stops being an expression of character and becomes a barricade. It is no longer just who you are, it is what keeps you from collapsing. That barricade starts to fail when Kaneki is driven to feed. Starving, shaking, almost delirious, he is dragged toward a corpse at the construction site. Nothing about the scene feels empowering. His body lunges while his mind recoils. He resists until resistance becomes physically impossible. And when he finally eats, the real horror is not only the act, it is the relief. His body says yes to what his identity cannot bear. That is where the fracture opens. The old Kaneki cannot absorb the truth of the new one. If he admits that hunger belongs to him now, then the image he uses to survive, kind, harmless, morally untouched, starts to crack. If he refuses to admit it, then every necessary act becomes damnation. Either way, he suffers. Nietzsche's warning about monsters gets flattened into a slogan about becoming violent. What he sees is sharper. The danger is not only that suffering makes you cruel, it is that suffering can force you to build a self so rigid, so morally brittle, that reality keeps smashing into it. Kaneki does not become monstrous here because he feeds. He moves toward monstrosity because he experiences part of himself only as contamination. As part of themselves as contamination, hatred is never far behind. Then Hinami loses both parents, and whatever innocence Kaneki was still trying to preserve gets harder to believe in. Her mother dies, her father is hunted down. The investigators speak the language of duty. The ghouls speak the language of survival. Both sides call themselves justified. A little girl is left carrying grief too large for her body. Kaneki can do almost nothing except stand close enough to witness it. That helplessness matters. It strips away the fantasy that one side is simply humane and the other simply monstrous. Human can kill. Ghoul can mourn. Justice can look like cruelty. Survival can look like tenderness. Mercy no longer has a stable address. And when the world stops offering clean moral borders, people cling harder to whatever feels clean inside them. That is what Kaneki is doing. His gentleness is not naivete. It is his last uncontaminated territory. If he loses that, what remains? A body that feeds on people, a mind crowded by shame, a growing suspicion that Rise's worldview may not be madness so much as clarity without comfort. This is why his softness feels moving and dangerous at the same time. It is moving because it is his refusal to let pain dictate his whole soul. It is dangerous because the refusal is becoming absolute. Trauma pushes people into this shape all the time. They do not just reject what hurt them, they build a complete identity around the rejection. Be that. I will never want that. I will never do that. The vow gives structure. It also creates fragility. Because if life keeps forcing them toward anger, force, or appetite, then each concession feels like self-betrayal. Eventually the choice becomes unbearable. Break the identity, or let the identity break you. That is the cost gathering underneath Kaneki's mercy. He still believes compassion can save him because compassion is the only thing that lets him look in the mirror without collapsing. But Nietzsche's question is already there, beneath every quiet act of kindness. Is this mercy coming from strength, or is it a hiding place built by fear? If it is only a hiding place, it will not hold forever. Hunger will keep returning. Loss will keep returning. Violence will keep demanding an answer. And when the shelter finally gives way, Pain will not ask merely to be endured. It will ask to become who he is. This is where surviving suffering begins to edge towards surrendering to the monster it creates. But this is where Kaneki's strategy stops protecting him. Jason ties him to a chair and turns torture into routine. That is what makes it feel so evil. Not rage, procedure. He crushes Kaneki's fingers one by one, waits for them to heal, then crushes them again. To pass the time, he counts backward by 7, 1,000, 993, 986. Before long, the numbers stop sounding like Jason's voice and start echoing inside Kaneki's own skin. Oh. The room begins to feel arranged around that rhythm. Pain is no longer an event. It is a schedule. And Jason is not only hurting him, he is teaching him. He drags a mother and child into the room and forces an impossible choice into existence. Keep resisting and let other people pay for it, or give in and become complicit anyway. The lesson is viciously clear. Your compassion is not noble here. It is usable. The fact that you care only gives your enemy another place to push the knife. This is the moment endurance stops being passive. It starts remaking the person who endures. Until now, Kaneki has survived by dividing himself. Human self on one side, ghoul hunger on the other. Kindness as essence, appetite as stain. He keeps believing that if he suffers long enough without yielding, he can come through morally untouched. Jason destroys that hope. Under this kind of pain, the question is no longer whether Kaneki can take it. The question is what kind of mind can keep taking it and still remain recognizable. That is painfully real. People under sustained humiliation often begin with one promise. This will not change who I am, but when pain becomes regular, softness starts to feel unsafe. Mercy starts to feel expensive. The self that once seemed decent begins to look fragile, almost foolish. Survival demands a harder shape. That is the trap Kaneki falls into. In the middle of that collapse, Reese appears in his mind, not as comfort, as permission. Space of blood, flowers, and memory, she tells him to stop recoiling from what he is. Stop treating his ghoul nature like a disease he must apologize for. Stop clinging to a version of goodness that only leaves him open to slaughter. For most of the story, Kaneki has acted as if morality means refusing part of himself. Rise offers him a crueler answer. If this hunger is yours, then own it. If the world keeps punishing hesitation, stop hesitating. This is where Nietzsche matters most, and where he is easiest to misuse. He did not think suffering was automatically noble. He did not think pain improves people on its own. His point was harsher. Suffering either crushes you, or you force it into form. You make something from it. A style, a discipline, a self that can contain it. That is self-overcoming in its most dangerous sense. Not simply surviving injury, but reorganizing yourself so the injury no longer has the final word. Kaneki does that, and Tokyo Ghoul makes the result disturbing instead of triumphant, because the self he creates is built with Jason's tools. When Kaneki emerges, his hair is white. The scene lands because it feels like release and loss at the same time. He is no longer pleading, no longer panicking, no longer trying to protect the old image of himself. He moves with a calm that is somehow more frightening than rage. He defeats Jason easily, but the real turn is not the victory, it is what follows. Kaneki cracks his fingers, the way Jason did. The counting. He sends the language of torture back through the man who taught it to him. That is why the scene is so unsettling. It is not just revenge, it is inheritance. Kaneki has found a way to survive unbearable suffering. He survives by making pain part of who he is. Not a wound he carries, but a structure he lives inside. He becomes strong, yes, but he becomes strong in Jason's grammar. That is the cost. This is where Nietzsche sharpens the scene instead of excusing it. Kaneki has overcome helplessness, but not cleanly. He has stopped being prey. He has stopped asking the world for mercy. Those are real changes, but he gets there by absorbing the logic of his tormentor. In plain terms, he learns strength from cruelty and mistakes that lesson for freedom. Nietzsche's idea of resentment helps here. A person can look transformed while still being ruled by the original wound. They can act, dominate, reinvent themselves, and yet their inner world still revolves around the injury. Jason is no longer holding the pliers, but Jason remains in the gesture, the rhythm, the performance. Kaneki looks newly powerful, yet part of that power is still obedience to what was done to him. You see versions of this all the time. Someone grows up powerless and swears never to feel that small again. Later they become harsh, controlling, impossible to reach. They call it strength. Sometimes it is strength, but sometimes it is fear with better posture. Sometimes, I will never be who. Art, again, turns slowly into I will never be soft again, and then into I will never let anyone near the place where I was hurt. The armor works. That is why people keep it. But after a while, they no longer know where the armor ends and the self begins. That is what makes Kaneki so compelling here. You want this moment for him. You want him to rise from the chair. You want Jason terrified. The release is real. The satisfaction is real. And the series refuses to let that be the whole truth, because the same moment that frees him also narrows him. He does not just reject helplessness. He begins rejecting the version of himself that still believed strength had to answer to tenderness. That is where the monster begins. Not in the ghoul body, not in the hunger. In the conclusion, his suffering is teaching him to draw. If kindness can be exploited, then cruelty must be safer. If compassion makes you breakable, then numbness must be freedom. It is a terrible thought, and after what he has endured, it does not sound irrational. It sounds earned. That is what makes it dangerous. A person can build an entire self from that logic. My detachment is maturity. My numbness is discipline. My coldness is clarity. My capacity for violence is honesty. What first appears as adaptation hardens into principle. Pain becomes personality, then worldview. And because it once kept them alive, they defend it, as if surrendering it would mean dying. So the chapter ends in a victory that does not feel clean. Kaneki survives the unbearable by turning pain into identity. That choice saves him. It may also begin ruining him. Because once pain becomes the core of the self, letting go of it starts to feel like self-betrayal. And that pushes the central question into focus with real force. When a person overcomes suffering by becoming unbreakable, when does that stop being survival and become surrender to the monster the suffering created? After Jason, Kaneki does not walk back into Anteku as the same boy who once apologized too quickly and held trays like they might judge him. He comes back with white hair, a quieter face, and a sentence that sounds noble enough to end the argument before it starts. He needs to become stronger so he can protect everyone. It is one of the cruelest promises in Tokyo Ghoul because he means it. And because hidden inside it is the logic that will pull him away from everyone he loves. He does not leave Anteku because he stops loving it. He leaves because he decides love now requires distance, secrecy, and a willingness to become frightening. The place that taught him how to live gently begins to look, in his own mind, like a shelter for someone weaker than he can afford to be. That matters as much as the torture itself. Jason breaks his body, but Kaneki is the one who gives that pain a mission afterward. At Anteku he had learned a delicate kind of survival. Not innocence, not denial, but restraint. Yoshimura's patience. Concern behind irritation. Hinami finding Meidi for the first time, a room where fear did not occupy every corner. Coffee poured carefully under warm light. Small routines that made a brutal world briefly livable. After Jason, Kaneki starts reading those things differently, not as forms of strength, but as traces of the self that failed. Pain teaches him a brutal lesson. If you depend on others, they can be used against you. If you need warmth, you can be broken through it. If you hesitate, someone stronger decides what you become. This is where people flatten Nietzsche into a quote and miss the point. What does not kill me makes me stronger does not mean suffering is good for you. It means suffering can force a person to rebuild themselves. It can destroy old values and make new ones feel necessary. But Nietzsche never promises the new values will be wise. Pain can produce clarity. It can also produce worship of whatever helped you endure. That is what happens to Kaneki. He turns strength into moral truth because he discovered it in agony. He begins to believe the self born in torture is more real than the self that existed before it. So he leaves. He moves through Aogiri's shadow, joins Banjo, hunts for Kano, and keeps widening the distance between himself and Anteku. Toka, Hinami, even the cafe itself become things he must protect by refusing to belong to them. The sadness of that choice is easy to miss, because it looks at first like resolve. G. Responsibility. He is taking too much of it onto himself. He decides that if danger has to be touched, he will be the one to touch it. If ugliness has to be carried, he will carry it. If someone has to bear the stain, it should be him. On the surface, that sounds selfless. Psychologically, it is narrower and darker. He is trying to make sure no one ever sees him helpless again. That is a deeply human move. Some people survive humiliation, betrayal, or violence by making one private vow: never again. Never again dependent, never again soft in the wrong room, never again in a position where love can become leverage. They call it maturity, discipline, realism. Sometimes it is all three, but often it is fear with principles wrapped around it. Isolation starts sounding like duty. Emotional distance starts sounding like protection. The person says, "I'm doing this for everyone," and partly they are, but they are also building a self no one can reach. You can see it in the way Kaneki fights after Jason. The old hesitation is mostly gone. He does not freeze at the edge of violence in the same way. He pushes forward, takes damage, keeps moving, keeps searching for answers about Kano and the machinery behind his suffering. There is focus in him now, direction, even competence. These are real gains. That is what makes the change so dangerous. His brutality is not chaotic. It is organized. His pain has made him effective, and effectiveness is persuasive. Growth. Nietzsche admired self-overcoming, but he did not mean becoming harder at any cost. He meant refusing imprisonment by fear, resentment, or inherited weakness. Kaneki thinks that is what he is doing. But there is another Nietzschean truth circling him. When you stare into the abyss long enough, you do not come away untouched. Kaneki does not simply add strength to the kindness he learned at Anteku. He begins to distrust that kindness itself. He no longer sees tenderness as something strength should protect. He sees it as the condition that once made him breakable. That is the turn. Once pain becomes identity, healing starts to feel false. If suffering gave birth to the self that can survive, then ordinary warmth begins to look cheap by comparison. This is why wounded people cling to the hardness that saved them, long after it starts harming everyone around them. The scar stops being something they carry. It becomes the standard by which they judge what is real. Anything softer starts to look childish, exposed, unsafe. Kaneki does this without fully admitting it. He still cares for Toka. He still cares for Hinami. That is exactly why being near them hurts. Anteku becomes more than a cafe. It becomes a mirror held up to the self he can no longer respect. The boy who still wanted comfort, who could be held together by other people's patience, who did not yet treat pain as proof of depth. That boy embarrasses him. He does not integrate that former self. Him. And when someone survives by dividing themselves this way, the rejected half does not disappear. It waits underneath the stronger identity, carrying all the need, grief, and shame the stronger self refuses to own. That is why the cafe has to be left twice. First in his mind, then in his life. Kaneki says he wants strength so he can protect everyone. But hidden inside that promise is a colder rule. Closeness is a liability. If people stay near him, they can be harmed, but they can also interrupt the identity he has built. They can remind him that he still wants things he has decided to despise: rest, trust, comfort, dependence. So he keeps his distance, and calls that distance necessary. The protector becomes solitary, and solitude becomes proof that the transformation is complete. But this kind of strength always takes more than it saves. Love is reduced to surveillance from afar. Care becomes control. Presence becomes absence justified by sacrifice. The person doing the protecting slowly disappears into the role of protector until there is almost no self left outside duty and damage. So when does overcoming suffering become surrendering to the monster it creates? Maybe it happens when strength stops serving love and starts replacing it. When pain is no longer something you survived, but the authority you trust most. When the part of you that learned to endure decides it alone deserves to lead. Kaneki leaves Anteku saying he is doing it for others. That is true. It is not the whole truth. The first thing this new strength protects is the self formed under Jason's torture. The self that believes being needed is dangerous, being gentle is weakness, and being alone is the price of becoming real. and the people who love him are left outside that decision, waiting in the one place that once taught him another way to live. Then comes the moment when the logic turns visible. When Kaneki fights Ayato, what makes the scene horrifying is not only the sound of bone breaking, it is the control. Kaneki does not lose himself. He counts, chooses, snaps Ayato's bones one after another with the calm of someone proving a theorem to himself. He tells himself he is doing it for Toka, for Hinami. Protection becomes the sentence that clears him. Love becomes the reason he gives himself permission to be cruel. That is what makes it so hard to look at. Kaneki is no longer simply enduring violence. He has learned how to use it without trembling. The earlier Kaneki wanted small things: coffee at Anteku, awkward conversation, a place where nobody looked at him like a threat. He wanted the ordinary mercy of being allowed to exist beside other people. After Jason, that desire does not disappear, but it gets buried beneath something harsher. He stops asking how to remain gentle in a brutal world. He starts asking how to become the kind of person brutality cannot break twice. This is close to Nietzsche's idea of self-overcoming, but only close. On can turn suffering into discipline, force, shape. They can refuse to stay only the victim of what happened to them. But self-overcoming is supposed to create a fuller self, not a narrower one. With Kaneki, the change goes wrong there. He does not simply use pain to become stronger. He lets pain tell him what a self is. You can see it in the way he moves afterward. With Aogiri, with the CCG, with nearly everyone around him, he becomes colder and more strategic. He withholds plans, leaves others outside decisions that affect them, spends his body like it belongs to no one. Hunger, injury, exhaustion, mutilation, he treats all of it as acceptable cost. Again and again, he behaves as if the only self-worth being is the self that can take the most punishment and still keep moving. That is not ordinary courage, it is a belief system. If pain once made him powerless, then he will become the kind of person who can absorb anything. If meeting others left him exposed, then he will become someone who needs no one. And the dark truth is that this works. Hardening does protect you. If you become unreadable, people cannot reach your softest places so easily. If you expect betrayal, betrayal shocks you less. If you decide your body is expendable, fear loses some of its grip. That is why damaged people become attached to their armor. The armor solves a real problem. The trap is that it solves it by changing what kind of person you are allowed to be. You see this outside fiction constantly. Why? Someone survives neglect, humiliation, betrayal, chaos. At first, they become cautious. Then caution becomes distance. Distance becomes pride. They start calling isolation strength. They like being the one who does not ask, does not explain, does not need reassurance, does not depend. It feels clean, superior even. But what they are actually protecting is the wound's authority over them. They would rather be self-contained than risk being hurt in the same place again. That is Kaneki's pattern. He says he is protecting people, but the protection he offers comes with a condition. Let me disappear behind it. Let me decide alone. Let me suffer alone. On the surface, noble. Psychologically, more troubling. He is not only trying to save others, he is trying to control the terms of pain. If he chooses suffering himself, then he never has to feel as helpless as he did under Jason. If he becomes the one who walks into violence, then he never has to be only its victim again. That is why his isolation is tragic, not heroic. The people who care about him are not protected by his secrecy. They are shut out by it. Toka cannot reach him. His allies cannot help carry his weight because he refuses to hand them any of it. He hides his damage, conceals his plans, bleeds in private, starves in private, collapses in private. He calls this responsibility. But a life built around never burdening anyone eventually becomes a life in which no one is allowed to love you properly. Oid is not only his softness. It is reciprocity, the basic exchange of care that made Anteku feel like home. Nietzsche becomes sharper here. The point is not merely do not become cruel while fighting cruelty. It is also this: be careful what virtue you make absolute. Strength, endurance, discipline, these can be life-giving. But when one virtue swallows all the others, it begins feeding on everything human around it. Kaneki makes endurance sacred. Once he does that, tenderness starts looking weak. Dependence starts looking shameful. Being understood starts to feel more dangerous than being wounded. That is the real shift in him. Violence is only the visible part. The deeper change is that being known becomes intolerable. If someone sees how frightened, needy, or broken he still is, then the identity he built after torture begins to crack. So he clings harder to the self that can suffer silently. He would rather be useful than intimate, feared than exposed, necessary than loved. And that is why his victories stop feeling like victories. Yes, he becomes stronger. Yes, he survives things that would have destroyed the person he used to be. Yes, he can make enemies hesitate. But every triumph costs him contact. He becomes less reachable to Toka, less honest with the people beside him, less able to receive the belonging he once wanted more than anything. He can defeat threats, but he cannot return to the space where he is held as a person instead of used as a weapon. The central wound of his transformation, pain, gave him a shape he could trust. As long as he is the one who endures, the one who sacrifices, the one who keeps going, he knows who he is. Without that, he faces a more frightening question. Who is he when he is not suffering for someone? Who is he when he is simply allowed to need? A lot of people understand that feeling more than they want to admit. Sometimes the original wound heals enough that life could become softer, but softness feels unreal. Damage is familiar. Hyperindependence is familiar. Being the strong one is familiar. So they keep performing the self their pain created, because at least that self is recognizable. Kaneki's tragedy is not merely that suffering changes him. Of course it changes him. His tragedy is that he starts treating the self built in torture as the most authentic one. When does overcoming suffering become surrendering to the monster it creates? Maybe it happens the moment strength stops serving connection and starts replacing it. The moment protection means becoming unreachable. The moment a person chooses to be unbreakable over being known, because being known would mean admitting the pain is still there. That is the cost. Kaneki turns pain into identity because he believes it is the only way to survive what happened to him. For a while, he is not wrong. It gives him structure, force, purpose. But survival bought at the cost of mutual care is not healing. It is another prison. He escapes hell. Helplessness by entering a new cage made of control, secrecy, and the refusal to let anyone touch what still hurts. And this is where the story darkens further. The self he forged to protect others can only keep functioning if he keeps cutting himself off from them. Not by dying, not by collapsing, but by becoming less and less recognizable to the people who once knew his face, until the only way he knows how to save them is to disappear inside the role. Then the world takes the test his new self cannot pass. Anteku burns, and the strength Kaneki built from suffering is exposed for what it cannot do. During the owl suppression operation, the CCG tears through the cafe. The familiar rooms fill with smoke. Tables splinter. Gunfire replaces conversation. Yoshimura walks out to meet the attack himself. Toka, Yomo, Irimi, Koma, everyone who made that place feel briefly livable, is pulled into battle, flight, or collapse. And Kaneki, who believed that becoming harder would let him protect what mattered, arrives too late. He can break investigators. He can survive torture. He can turn his body into a weapon. None of that stops his home from being destroyed. That is the price hidden inside his transformation. Nietzsche says a person should give style to their character. He does not mean posturing. He means taking the raw material of your life, fear, weakness, injury, appetite, and forcing some order onto it so that accident does not rule you completely. Someone building a self out of wreckage in the dark. He takes Jason's torture, his old passivity, his shame, his terror of helplessness, and turns them into one answer. Become the kind of thing that can never be cornered again. White hair, colder voice, no hesitation. Pain stops being something he endured and becomes evidence. If he can survive agony, then agony must have made him necessary. That idea keeps him moving. It also poisons him. Because the destruction of Anteku shows the limit of turning pain into identity. You can build discipline from suffering. You can build ferocity from humiliation. You can make yourself frightening enough that nobody mistakes you for weak again. But none of that gives you control over loss. Kaneki confuses self-overcoming with power over reality. Nietzsche's point is sharper than be strong. It is master what is within you, without pretending this mastery makes you sovereign over the world. Kaneki learns the first half and misses the second. He thinks that if he kills enough softness inside himself, the world will stop taking things from him. It does not. That mistake is painfully familiar. Some people survive by turning trauma into personality structure. They become efficient, unreadable, hard to disappoint because they refuse to need much. Their pain really does make them stronger in certain ways. They can endure. They can function while others freeze. But strength like that comes with a hidden bargain. Pend then quietly trains you to live as if tenderness is a liability. So when life presents a problem that cannot be solved by control, someone leaving, someone dying, someone needing comfort instead of competence, that identity starts to crack. Then Kaneki finds Hyde, not in some triumphant tableau. In the snow, after everything has already fallen apart, Hyde is wounded and waiting. The battle is over in the worst sense, not resolved, just spent. When Kaneki reaches him, there is no fury left to animate him, no speech left to steady him. Hyde is not another obstacle between him and survival. He is the oldest part of Kaneki's life, the person from before all of this, before hunger, before masks, before suffering became doctrine. Hyde knew him when he was timid, awkward, bookish, still trying to believe kindness was enough. Kaneki lifts him and carries him through the ruins. That image matters because it strips everything down. Snow falling over broken concrete and torn steel. Anteku behind him, gone. Hyde in his arms. And Kaneki can do almost nothing except keep walking. This is not the stride of someone who has conquered himself. It is the uneven walk of someone discovering, too late, that power cannot repay love. He became monstrous to keep from losing the people who mattered. Now, the most human thing he can do is carry one broken body through the cold, and pray he has not already failed. This is the clearest he has been in a long time, because in that walk, the fantasy falls away. He cannot fight this into meaning. He cannot force the night to reverse itself. He cannot outgrow grief by becoming more dangerous. He cannot even know if Hide can still be saved. All he can do is bear the weight. Nietzsche's Amor Fati can illuminate this, but only if we do not sentimentalize it. Love of fate does not mean liking pain. It means refusing to lie about reality. Refusing self-pity, yes, but also refusing illusion, standing inside what is real without inventing a comforting falsehood. Kaneki is not capable of that yet. He is not accepting fate here. He is barely moving through it, but for once there is almost nothing left between him and the truth is simple. Pain cannot become a self without taking something from the self. That is why this method of surviving never fully works. It promises mastery, but suffering does not care what story you build around it. It still takes people. It still exposes limits. It still arrives in forms strength cannot answer. If you make pain the core of your identity, you may become hard enough to endure almost anything. But you also risk becoming someone who only knows how to endure. Someone prepared for impact, not intimacy. Ready to resist death, but not ready to sit helplessly beside another person's wound. That is the state Kaneki is in when he reaches Arima. By then, the fight is almost beside the point. Kaneki is exhausted, carrying the remains of a philosophy that has already failed him. Ma meets him with that terrifying calm of his, clean, measured, almost procedural, as if violence has been refined in him into perfect method. Against that precision, Kaneki's accumulated suffering means very little. All the brutality he cultivated, all the pain he converted into resolve, all the monstrous force he taught himself to wield, none of it is enough. Arima defeats him completely. Not just the body, the belief underneath it, the faith that if he became terrible enough, he would never again have to be helpless. This is where the collapse becomes more than physical, because what breaks here is not only Kaneki's strength, it is the identity he built to survive unbearable suffering. Nietzsche warns that anyone who fights monsters must be careful not to become one. In Kaneki's case, the tragedy is not that he becomes cruel for pleasure. It is worse. He becomes monstrous for reasons that sound almost noble. To protect, to stop being prey, to keep others from paying for his weakness. But once that transformation hardens into identity, it stops being a tool and becomes a prison. He no longer uses monstrosity in moments of necessity. He needs it in order to know who he is. And when that monstrosity fails to save Hyde, fails to save Anteku, fails to defeat Arima, he is left with almost nothing beneath it. That is the darker psychological trap at his center. People often become versions of what once hurt them, not because they admire it, but because resemblance feels safer. Then vulnerability. If helplessness was unbearable, they become untouchable. If dependence led to pain, they become controlling. If tenderness invited injury, they become cold. The new self feels earned, adult, wise. But under pressure, its cost appears. It can intimidate, endure, dominate. Often it cannot comfort. It cannot trust. It cannot love without fear of humiliation. And when someone precious needs gentleness instead of force, that whole structure suddenly looks emotionally starved. That is why this chapter hurts. Not only because Kaneki loses, not only because Enteku falls. It hurts because his suffering can no longer be mistaken for meaning. Carrying Hide through the ruins is the bill finally coming due. Every earlier decision lives inside that image. Every time he chose hardness over closeness. Every time he mistook self-erasure for strength. Every time he believed that if he suffered enough and survived cleanly enough, the suffering would justify itself. It does not. It leaves him carrying the person who knew him best through the wreckage of the life that once made him human. And that is where the question turns unbearable. When does overcoming suffering become surrendering to the monster it creates? For Kaneki, it happens when strength stops being a way to protect life and becomes a way to survive its destruction. When pain is no longer something he bears, but something he must keep proving. When being broken and enduring that break become more central than vulnerability. In loving well, grieving openly, or remaining reachable. He wanted pain to become purpose. Instead, it became identity. And identity, in the end, could only carry Hide through the snow and arrive in time to lose almost everything. For a while, Ken Kaneki lives under a softer name. As Heisei Sasaki, he wakes in a clean room, puts on a pressed coat, teaches classes, writes reports, and speaks to damaged young investigators in a voice so careful it almost sounds borrowed. He stops Uri from turning ambition into cruelty. He watches Witsuki with quiet concern. He tries to keep Psycho moving without breaking her. He cooks for them, corrects them without humiliating them, and shields them from the CCG's machinery for as long as he can. In those scenes, there is something close to peace. Not happiness, not freedom. Relief. That is what makes Heisei so painful to watch. He is not simply fake. His kindness is real. His patience is real. The care he gives the Quinks is not performance. He means it. Heisei is not an empty disguise. He is a real self built under pressure. A decent man made possible by the removal of everything that once tore Kaneki apart. He feels like an answer to suffering because he seems to prove that a person can survive by cutting away the part that remembers. People do this outside fiction too. They become composed, dependable, useful. They build routines, stay busy, speak carefully, and are praised for how well they function. But sometimes that stability is not healing, it is scaffolding. Their life is arranged around one rule: do not touch the wound. They are not at peace. They are maintained. Heisei knows this before he can fully say it. The buried Kaneki does not return as a simple flashback. He appears like someone waiting in the next room. In those inner scenes, Kaneki watches him from the dark, quiet and patient, as if he knows his turn will come. Heisei is terrified of him. Not because he thinks the old self is unreal, but because he knows it is real. He understands somewhere beneath the calm that if Ken Kaneki fully returns, Heisei Sasaki may disappear. His peace depends on exclusion. His identity works only if another identity stays locked underground. That is why Nietzsche matters here in a more precise way. Self-overcoming is not pretending the broken part of you is gone. It is not becoming clean, pure, or untouched. For Nietzsche, strength is not the removal of conflict. It is the ability to take what is painful, shameful, chaotic, and still give it form without lying about it. A person becomes stronger not by erasing the wound, but by refusing to build a false self whose stability depends on denial. Heisei is composed, but composition is not wholeness. His peace is not resolution, it is an armistice. That is why Kaneki's return feels less like madness than truth rising. Buried pain does not weaken just because it is buried. It becomes indirect. It leaks into dreams, panic, silences, sudden terror. Is that seem larger than the moment. This is one of the most psychologically exact things in Tokyo Ghoul. What is refused does not stay still. It develops pressure. The self you bury does not quietly bless your survival without it. Then the story tightens. The Rose operation strains Heiss, but Cochlea corners him. The setting matters: concrete corridors, locked cells, institutional depth, a place built to contain what others are afraid to face. He is dragged back toward the architecture of his own fracture. Arima is there not just as superior officer, but as the fixed point around which Heiss's life has been allowed to exist. Edo pushes at the seam. Old names, old voices, old violence begin gathering around him. These are not just plot turns, they are psychological siege engines. The world stops cooperating with his division. The split cannot be maintained, because reality keeps putting both selves in the same room. And when memory returns, it does not feel heroic. It feels like loss. Heiss does not rise into some cleaner, stronger version of himself. He realizes that the life he came to care about cannot survive full recognition unchanged. That is what makes the moment sad. In Cochlea, when he stops resisting Kaneki and lets the buried self return, it is not triumph over weakness. It is the acceptance that peace purchased through self-erasure is still a kind of death. Nietzsche is useful here because he is harsher than the comforting version people quote online. He does not say suffering automatically deepens you. He does not say pain itself is wisdom. His point is sharper. If you turn away from what you are because it disgusts or terrifies you, you do not become better. You become divided. And a divided self will either collapse or become cruel to keep the split intact. Heiss tries to live as if gentleness can survive through ignorance. It cannot. Gentleness that depends on amnesia is fragile because it has never truly faced what it is trying to soften. This is why the return of memory matters so much. People fear remembering because memory does not only bring back events, it threatens the personality built to survive them. To remember is to risk the death of the version of yourself that kept functioning. That is why Heiss resists so desperately. He is not clinging to a lie because he is weak. He is clinging to the only structure that has let him breathe. But the story refuses the easy opposite too. Remembering is not enough. Bringing Kaneki back does not solve the problem by itself. The danger is not only in forgetting the monster. The danger is in making the monster your only truth. That is the deeper trap running through his whole life. He first survived torture by turning pain into identity. Then, as Heiss, he tried to survive by abandoning that identity completely. One self says, "I am my suffering." The other says, "I can live only if that suffering belongs to someone else." Neither can hold. That is what gives this section its quiet foe. RCE. Heiss is a brief proof that Kaneki can still be gentle, still be caring, still be loved in ordinary ways. You feel it in the domestic scenes, the classrooms, the way the Quinks begin to trust him. For a while, the series lets you believe he might remain there. It lets you feel what he is trying to protect. That is why the collapse hurts. We are not merely watching a mask crack. We are watching a real, hard-won piece reveal itself as too narrow to contain the truth. And that brings the central question back into focus. When does overcoming suffering become surrendering to the monster it creates? It happens when survival hardens into identity, and identity refuses to include anything that threatens it. Kaneki surrendered once by becoming pain. Heiss almost surrenders again by becoming peace at the price of truth. In both cases, the same mistake remains, choosing one fragment of the self and calling it salvation. The wound returns. The buried voice speaks. The life built on inner exile begins to shake. And because Heiss's calm is real, because his tenderness is real, what comes next is more frightening than before. Not because the monster is new, but because now we know exactly what will be lost when it takes the body back. And this is where the story finally grows quieter and sharper. For years, Kaneki survives by becoming harder than what broke him. Jason's torture teaches him that pain can be converted into function. Depeed in his mind. The flat voice, the willingness to mutilate and kill before being cornered again. None of that is random. It is a system. He takes what destroyed him and makes it look like choice. In fight after fight, that reads as growth. He is more decisive, more frightening, more capable of protecting the people around him. But much later, after disasters have become so large that his own body can swell into catastrophe, The most important things he does are almost painfully ordinary. He sits down with people who should hate him. He talks instead of tearing through. He helps make room for humans and ghouls to live in the same streets without immediately reducing each other to prey or threat. That shift matters because it reveals something severe and simple. Pain kept him alive, but it could not tell him what a life is for. You feel that most clearly in the later attempts at coexistence. These scenes do not have the rush of his earlier transformations. No snapping bones, no ecstatic violence, no thrill of finally becoming dangerous enough. Instead, there are meetings, compromises, uneasy alliances, and the constant chance that one mistake could drop everything back into slaughter. That is a different kind of risk. Kaneki has every reason to believe the world only has two positions, hunter or hunted. His whole life trained him to think that way. Human institutions tortured him, ghoul society used him, every identity came with another mask and another grave. Ofs toward negotiation. He is not being naive. He is acting against the most justified suspicion in him. That is what makes it difficult. Nietzsche has a precise name for that difficulty: self-overcoming. Not merely surviving suffering, not merely becoming stronger because of it. Something harder, overcoming the shape your suffering gave you. In plain language, not letting your wounds become your worldview. That is a greater victory than winning a fight. You can see why outside fiction too. Someone is humiliated, betrayed, abused, abandoned, and afterward, there is a magnetic temptation to build a complete self around the injury. To say, this is the truest thing that ever happened to me, so everything else must answer to it. Every relationship becomes a test. Every act becomes defense, revenge, or proof. Pain begins as something that happened to you. Then it becomes the thing you serve. That is the trap Kaneki keeps circling. Nietzsche warned about resentment, and he meant something more exact than bitterness. Resentment is what happens when a person cannot release an injury, so they reorganize their moral world around it. The wound becomes lens, then standard, then identity. It no longer says only, I was hurt. It says, my hurt reveals what reality is. Kaneki lives dangerously close to that logic. Once suffering becomes the clearest proof of who he is, monstrosity starts to feel truthful. If torture remade me, if hunger defines me, if I can only protect anyone by being terrifying, then maybe this is my real self. That is the seduction. Pain can feel honest simply because it leaves such deep marks. Nietzsche's answer is sharper than pain makes you stronger. Sometimes pain makes you repetitive. Sometimes it makes you worship the conditions that injured you. His point is not that suffering is unreal or unimportant. It is that suffering should not become sovereign. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how is quoted loosely, but here it helps. Kaneki's how is obvious. Torture, hunger, split identities, guilt, grief, the constant threat of becoming something inhuman. The real question is whether he can find a why that is not merely surviving the next blow. If all he has is the how, then pain remains his master even when he looks powerful. That is why Tuka matters, not because she restores innocence, and not because their relationship erases what he became. She matters because with her, especially in the later quiet, he does not have to keep performing the self built for emergency. He can be exhausted, he can hesitate, he can admit fear, he can be looked at without being reduced to a symbol, weapon, or project. There is something psychologically crucial in that. People who live too long in survival mode often trust pain more than care. Pain is predictable. Pain proves something happened. Tenderness can feel thin, suspicious, almost unreal by comparison. It asks for openness instead of vigilance. For someone like Kaneki, that eye is terrifying. Toka interrupts that pattern by staying concrete. Shared rooms, shared conversation, shared meals, or the nearest thing his body allows. A life measured not only by who must be saved or fought, but by who comes home, who waits, who notices when he is fraying. In those moments, he is not valuable because he can endure more than anyone else. He is valuable because he is there. That cuts directly against one of his oldest beliefs, that worth must be purchased through suffering. That is the hidden damage of turning pain into identity. You begin to believe that only what hurts is real. You can watch that happen in ordinary life. Some people become unable to receive care without mistrusting it. They only feel visible in crisis. They confuse being useful with being loved. being needed with being known. They perform toughness because softness feels counterfeit. Relief itself can feel like betrayal, as if healing would cheapen what they survived. Kaneki is believable because he moves through exactly that logic. His darkness is not just that he suffers, it is that he starts treating suffering as evidence of depth, almost proof that he finally has a self. The later calm matters because he does not stay there. What he reaches is not purity. Tokyo Ghoul never offers anything that clean. The dead remain dead. Violence is not cancelled. The arrangement between humans and ghouls is fragile, damaged, unfinished. But life becomes livable in a way it was not before. Continue. Bonds hold. A family becomes possible. Human and ghoul lives stay entangled, difficult, imperfect, and still worth carrying forward. That modesty is the point. The miracle is not transcendence. The miracle is that after everything, he does not answer horror by enlarging it. Nietzsche is useful here because he is often mistaken for a philosopher of hardness alone. But his deeper challenge is not to glorify the abyss. It is to avoid being organized by it. Strength is not only the ability to look into darkness. Sometimes strength is leaving it without dragging its logic into every room you enter. Amor fati does not mean romanticizing pain because it made you exceptional. It means saying yes to the whole of life, without kneeling before the worst part of it. It means creating values larger than your injuries. Kaneki's final movement is almost painfully modest. To survive unbearable suffering, he turned pain into identity. That worked for a while. It made him dangerous enough to endure a world that kept trying to consume him. But if he stays there, then the monster wins even if he survives. Because then suffering has done more than wound him. It has taught him what a person is for. That is the central danger all along. At what point does overcoming suffering become surrendering to the monster it creates? Not when you harden once. Not when you become violent to stay alive. The surrender happens when the defensive shape becomes sacred, when the emergency self becomes the only self you are willing to be. That is why the ending feels earned instead of sentimental. Kaneki does not defeat pain by dominating it. He defeats it by refusing to let it remain the meaning of his existence. He keeps enough of himself to return to other people, to love and be loved, to help build a world where survival is not hoarded through fear, but shared through restraint. And that is the ordinary miracle. Not that the monster disappears, but that it stops being his answer to everything. Not eating the world when the world gave him every reason to. Not making a home inside hunger. Not confusing damage with destiny. Just this. After all that suffering, he does not let pain decide what a life is for. Maybe that is the deepest thing Tokyo Ghoul leaves us with. Suffering does not only hurt us, it tempts us. It offers shape, certainty, permission. If the pain was unbearable, then building a self around it can feel like the only honest response. That is what Kaneki does. He survives by turning agony into structure. He lets it tell him what strength is, what love costs, what kind of person he must become if he never wants to be helpless again. And that is why his struggle feels larger than anime, larger than ghouls, larger even than Nietzsche. Because most people will never be tortured in a chair, or wake up in a body that hungers for human flesh. But many people do learn, in quieter ways, to become the person their suffering required. The one who never asks. Who never leans. The one who stays useful, stays guarded, stays hard enough that life cannot get the same grip twice. At first, that really is survival. It may even be necessary. But the danger begins when the mask that saved you becomes the face you are afraid to live without. That is when overcoming starts to blur into surrender. Not when you become strong. Not even when you become frightening. But when the self built for emergency starts ruling every ordinary moment. When pain becomes your evidence that you are real. When distance feels safer than love, and control feels truer than trust. When you would rather remain armored than be known. Kaneki's final answer is fragile, and that is why it matters. He does not solve suffering. He does not purify himself of violence, grief, hunger, or memory. He does something harder. He stops letting the wound be sovereign. He does not deny the monster. He does not worship it either. He learns, slowly and imperfectly, that a human life cannot be built only around what kept it alive in the dark. Nietzsche's real challenge was never simply to endure pain, it was to create beyond it, to refuse a life whose meaning is permanently dictated by injury. Kaneki gets close to losing that battle. More than once he mistakes hardness for truth. More than once he treats suffering as the deepest thing about him. And maybe that is the haunting part. How understandable it is. How often people do the same. Because some wounds do not only leave scars. Ours. They start making promises. They promise safety. They promise identity. They promise that if you keep carrying them, you will never be powerless again. But if you listen too long, you begin to belong to them. And maybe that is the line we spend our whole lives trying to see clearly. The difference between the strength that protects your soul and the strength that slowly replaces it. Kaneki survives horror by becoming something harder than the boy who first entered that alley. The question that lingers is whether any of us can suffer deeply, change completely, and still return with enough softness left to call ourselves human. If this gave shape to something you have been feeling, stay with that for a while. The anime mind is a place to grow while you sleep, and to understand yourself through story. Rest, reflect, and let the ideas settle.